It's time for Tab Talks, your weekly conversation about matters of faith. I'm your host, Jennifer Rash.
And I'm your co-host, Debbie Campbell.
We've been watching, listening, absorbing, trying to process all that's happening in our nation right now. And while technically none of us should be asking how we can help without first doing the research from what's really been available to us our entire lives, but we did want to have a conversation to help us all think in a fresh way about how churches, maybe the universal church, can foster unity and trust among all people, but specifically right now between Black and white communities. Our friend James Sutton has joined us today. He is a minister in the Birmingham-area, a graduate of Stanford University's Beeson Divinity School, and currently working on the Diversity Advisory Council for Converge, a Christian organization that promotes biblical justice and helps churches with resources they need. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, we have so many questions, but we also know that you were recently in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I can't say all the M's. And I wanted to ask you about that experience. What took you there? What did you see? What was it like? What did you come back with?
Well, it was a phenomenal opportunity. I'm on the Diversity Advisory Council for Converge, and working with their Office of Biblical Diversity. Their vice president, who formed the council, invited me to go with him. Converge has about 11 districts across the country, and the North Central District is where Minnesota is. And so he went and took me with him to kind of speak to some pastors there, to kind of give them some insight about how to engage with this issue there, and to also kind of foster and broker some relationships with local pastors, local Black pastors in the area. So that was the purpose of our trip. The trip itself was, I can only say, really emotional, and really overwhelming in a lot of ways, just to be on the ground where George Floyd was murdered, where his life was taken from him, and to feel the energy of the community where he, lived and worked and played and enjoyed life. It was really emotional. We also had a chance to go to his memorial service, which was also very emotional. If you watched, there was a time where there was an 8-minute and 46-second pause to a moment of silence, for the amount of time that the officer's knee was on Mr. Floyd's neck. If you do that, if you just sit still for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that is a very long time. I wept the whole entire time. So just an emotional time, but I drew a lot of energy from the people there.
What have you been able to do coming back and sharing your story like you're sharing with us today? I'm sure you've been sharing with several others. What's the impact been like?
The impact on the trip was, for me, and I think for a lot of Black people, this George Floyd is just the latest person in a very, very long list of people who have had their lives taken by police officers, or people who saw themselves as police officers. So, for example, the Ahmaud Arbery case, you have neighbors who are essentially kind of vigilantes who see a Black man and he's shot in the middle of the street for being a suspected robber. Come to find out, he was not robbing anyone. He was an innocent person. He was unarmed. Same thing with Trayvon Martin. He's walking home with Skittles and iced tea, and someone sees him, they see his skin color, and they think he's automatically a suspect, and he's dead. And so it's just another person. For me, George Floyd, he could have been my older cousin. He would have been the cousin who was taking me somewhere I shouldn't have been going when I was younger. He would have been the person telling me things that I shouldn't have known at the time. But we would have looked back at a family reunion and just laughed about how naive I was and about those times. So I see him as somebody who could have easily been an older cousin to me. And so it's emotional in that regard.
As you've looked at the, or talked to, I guess, with people in both Minnesota and here in Alabama and probably everywhere in between, are you seeing a commonality between people of faith and how they're processing this?
I've seen I've seen more whites being engaged in marches, in speaking out, than I think we've really ever seen before. And for me, I wasn't there during this time, but it seems like more than were marching during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s.
Okay.
In many cases, white people will outnumber Black people in some of the marches and some of the protests. So I think that's a very different scene than we have, ever had a chance to witness. And I think that's a cause for hope. Um, but the other difference is more people seem to be talking about actual, tangible change within the police handling of these kind of cases and handling these kinds of issues, which I hope is one of the outcomes of the unfortunate death and murder of George Floyd.
Maybe I think I interrupted you earlier. Do you have a question?
Well, he answered my question
Mhm.
about how many, he thought, my question was, James, was like, how many, could you see a difference in more white people joining, and truly being engaged? And I think they are. Do you think it's across the board, or do we see more of our younger people getting involved?
Yeah, I saw in Minneapolis, I saw mostly young. So they're going to be, I would say, 20 somethings, 30 somethings, young couples that I saw. There was some older people, but not that many. But also we've seen people in Germany, in France, in New Zealand, in many other countries outside of America who are marching, who are standing up, and who are standing in solidarity with Black people in America, and who have galvanized around the murder of George Floyd.
Are there any differences between Black Christians and white Christians and how they're responding right now? Can you see anything that stands out to you?
Well, Black Christians and white Christians really have always responded differently to these kinds of issues. Unfortunately, Black people, in the same way that there are two Americas, that we experience, one that white people experience and then one that Black people experience, there's also two churches, unfortunately. And we have had to mourn and grieve alone many times. Paul says, Romans chapter 12, weep with those who weep. And most of the time in our existence here in America, we have had to weep alone. We have had to mourn alone. As a matter of fact, a lot of our mourning and weeping has been propagated by our white Christian brothers and sisters. So it has been those elements. But I think over time, more and more white brothers and sisters seem to be becoming aware and conscious of the history of this country, of the history within their own churches and denominations, and seem to be waking up. And I think that's very, very positive. We certainly need more of that. But the fact that we have a lot of brothers who are maybe even preaching now sermons that they wouldn't have preached 5 years ago, are preaching sermons now. And I think, God has called every pastor to be a prophetic voice. not to just comfort people, but sometimes we have to really disrupt people's comfort, especially if there's sin involved, and because we're shepherding people's souls, and we have to really take advantage or really be accountable for that.
I know a lot of people are asking all these questions, but are there some basic steps, again, probably should have already been being done, but are there some basic steps we could share with churches and believers who are really truly interested in taking that next step? What would be one or two things to start right away?
Yeah. Listening is always important. If you're in any relationship, listening is going to be at the top of the list, right? You married, you got to listen, especially if you're a man out there. You really have to work on that. But
yes, that is true.
So and that doesn't mean just asking your Black friend a question, but there are interviews that have already been done that you can listen to. There are speeches that have already been given that you could listen to. There are books, there are podcasts, there are articles. And as you said, all of this material has been there since there was an issue with race, an issue with justice. And a lot of times when our white brothers and sisters ask us, what can we do? It becomes clear that they have not been listening for the last 400 years, because we've already answered that question. We've said, here's a blueprint for how to solve these problems. Or I've been asked the question, well, what do Black people want from white people? That's simple. We've really already answered that question. We need to change some systems. We need to change some things that are imbalanced in our country. And to white pastors, I say you have to preach in a different way that is going to really, if you do it right and if you do it the way Jesus did, some people probably will leave. John chapter 6, Jesus said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part of me. And the Bible says, and many departed from him that day. They left him.
Wow, that's
So,
right.
if they'll leave Jesus, and we know he was perfect, we know he was right, would I say something like that today? I mean, yeah, we would have to, but not specifically about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, but something prophetic, something that might cause people to leave. Do we want people to leave? No, we want people to stay. We want people to be full of the Holy Spirit and convicted by the Holy Spirit. But unfortunately, some people will not. They can also learn. I think one of the tragedies of both the church and the school system is we really learn kind of a slanted history of America. We learn kind of an exceptionalism about America. So even in Minnesota, I listened to a podcast on my way there, and it was a podcast about how America really came to possess the land, and how it was the Indians, the natives were duped out of their land, tricked into a treaty that they signed, and they didn't know that they were signing over their rights to the land. And that's how Minnesota is created. That's how North Dakota and the Dakotas were created. So we have to learn that history. I met two people from the Ojibwa tribe there. And these are natives. We don't even see them really anymore, right? But, we have to really do the history about how we came to possess this land, and tell the actual truth of the story. We also have to learn that there's a history with Black people and police. The first police for Black people were slave catchers. So we've always had problems with law enforcement. We've always had problems with people who were deputized by the state to police us, to target us, to watch us. And then the fugitive slave law would literally deputize white citizens, give them a badge and a gun and say, hey, if you find anybody black who's out here walking, you have the right to stop them. You have the right to question them, right? This is what the McMichaels did with Ahmaud Arbery. They were like fugitive slave catchers. This is what George Zimmerman was with Trayvon Martin. He's like a fugitive slave catcher. He felt he had the right to stop him and question him just because he was black and free. So learning that history, why have we always had a problem with the police, even up to this present day? You know, the Confederate soldiers became the KKK, and then the KKK became police officers, right? So we've always had this antagonistic relationship. It's never been about whether we committed crimes or not. It's always been about policing us, targeting us, and protecting white citizens from us. So there's a lot to learn that if our white brothers and sisters did that work, I think their eyes would be open to a great deal of what we're seeing even up to this present day and how they can actually help.
We're listening to Tab Talks. We are discussing racial justice, biblical justice with James Sutton, a minister in the Birmingham area, graduate of Peace and Divinity School, and currently serving on the Diversity Advisory Council for Converge. James, as you've helped us think through all of this, what are some tips for insensitivity that might happen? You know, sometimes a white Christian can mean well, but then say something that is just absolutely insensitive and maybe truly innocent in, you know, trying to be sincere, but just insensitive. What are some obvious things that you've experienced that you could help us know about?
Well, you know, I think that's going to happen. You know, it's unfortunate, but it will happen. And I think, you know, for most black people, you know, we're going to be willing to give those white folks benefit of the doubt. We'll know, you know, that they're sincerely trying, and we will give them the benefit of the doubt. But, you know, other things, I think here again, there are a lot of books that will really help white people to answer some of their own questions. White Fragility, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the Lunch Table is another book. Those kind of things, if they make that investment in themselves, will eliminate a whole lot of stepping into, you know, ditches. And I think too, if they really do have genuine relationships with someone who's black, I always tell people, if you have somebody black who works for you and depends on you for a paycheck, that's not your friend. That's your employee.
Right.
And so I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if you all are. But, you know, you have to have a legitimate friendship with the person in order to be able to have those kind of conversations. The guy who works for you, the woman who works for you, is not the person you really want to be having that conversation with. The guy you're supervising, or female you're supervising, that's a subordinate, insubordinate relationship. You need a relationship with somebody who is your equal, who does not need or depend on you for food or for shelter or for clothes, who can actually tell you the truth, right? And I see a lot of, you know, my white brothers and sisters who are helping someone, maybe giving clothes to someone, so somebody who's poor, but then they'll turn around and talk to them about race. That person cannot tell you the truth because they don't want to offend you.
Oh, wow.
So you need a relationship with somebody who is your social and intellectual equal in order to be able to get the real truth from somebody.
And I'm guessing too, we have to be willing and ready to hear the truth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just like they walked away from Jesus, I've had white people walk away from me. Other black people have had white people walk away from them. I've been a part of many conversations where the things came up and the truth was told, And that was the end of the conversation. Unfortunately, I think our white brothers and sisters enter into these conversations wanting genuinely to help, but not really being prepared for the full reality of the truth of our experience in this country, or the truth of, how this country came into being. Some people are very invested in a false narrative. And when that narrative gets disrupted, they check out because their need is to maintain that false narrative.
Is there hope?
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
Is there hope, James?
I think so. And as a Christian, as a believer, we have to always maintain hope. Psalm 42, hope in God. Lamentations is, here's a man who's weeping, who's going through excruciating pain of betrayal. He feels like God has betrayed him, but yet he comes back to the conclusion, his mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. So yes, there is a need to hope, but we also have to fight. We have to pray as people of faith, and everybody who's working toward racial justice is not a person of faith. But as people of faith, we definitely have to maintain hope. And our hope is not necessarily that this world will get better. That's not always the case. But our hope is that God will be glorified and that victory will be won because Jesus got up. That's where the real hope is. The hope is not that all these systems will actually really change. I don't know that they will. But I do know that God is on the throne. I do know that vengeance is his. He will reserve final judgment for all those who have oppressed, who have murdered, who have stolen, who have harmed the widow and the orphan and the immigrant. And he will get the victory.
James, I have some friends that have said, and they're white friends, they say, oh, I don't see color. And I think we probably all had people that have said that to us. Oh, no, I don't see color when I see others. What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm thinking, yeah, you've got to. And we get beyond that in our relationships with one another. But what do you think? Is that just kind of a cop-out? Do you think people are just trying to say, oh, yeah, I'm okay? I don't know.
Yeah, I think some people, and kind of to Jennifer's question earlier about some missteps. Yeah, I think people think that that's helpful. They think that not seeing color is the right way or the right thing.
Yeah.
But here's the thing about God. Everything he did was intentional. Every single thing he did was planned. It was orchestrated with thought, with love. And what he gave us, our gender, our color, our hair texture, our eyes, our eye color, everything about us testifies to his glory. And it testifies to the fact that he's not a one-trick pony who can just draw stick figures. But he desires to be glorified. He desires for when people see us, they worship God, that they know there's a God. We are a part of his creation. So the shade of our skin, the shape of our eyes, the size of our nose, everything about us, our height, our width, is all a reflection of the diversity of God, the glory of God, and the majesty of God. So to not see my color is to say I don't see that element of God. I don't
Well, that's going to be the word we're going to have to end it on that, James. You are amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
A great question. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week.